This lecture is going to describe and talk about a certain research project which deals with efforts of agencies to provide housing to very, very low income rural communities in the developing world, and the case for carrying out this research has been chosen as Bangladesh as a country case study. Now, to begin with, the basis of the study was there were two main bases. First is that it actually wanted to fill in the gap in knowledge or discourse in this particular field of architecture in the developing world. And the gap is that firstly, if one goes through literature, current literature, one notices that there is a great emphasis on urban areas and a lot of studies on urban housing, urban environmental change, and so on, but very little on the rural areas. And this is because many of the urban areas, cities in the developing world, have been growing very, very rapidly, and it is almost like a fear or a paranoia that many of these settlements are just going like out of control, and that is why all these studies are focused on the urban area. But saying that, the majority of the population in the developing world, and probably even in the whole world, still live in rural areas. Probably up to 60% of the population of the world live in rural areas. And even saying that, there's very little study on the housing conditions of rural communities. And that is why this study, this research, wanted to provide an insight and a knowledge in this aspect of the field. Secondly, now taking this country case study which I mentioned, Bangladesh, it was seen that many organizations were working there, and many of them were working in rural areas, but of course without the benefit of knowledge or studies done in that field, but because of the same reason which I mentioned before, that there hadn't been many studies done in this field really, and because of these projects being built, a lot of them were built somewhat in an ad hoc fashion, very often as responses to crises, which I'll mention later. But there's a lack of evaluation of many of these efforts, and this is what this study, this research wanted to do. It was mainly a form of evaluation of these efforts of organizations or agencies to provide housing for very, very low income populations. And that is why the study, the name of the study it's a study of agency intervention in this field. Saying that, now I should mention a little bit about low income communities. What are low-income communities? What do they really face? What are their problems? And I believe that the problems are the same all over the world, not only in the developing world, but even in the developed world. Poor communities face some very, very typical impediments, and these impediments especially in building housing for themselves. The first one, and which is the most basic and rudimentary, is financial resource constraints. They don't have enough money to build houses. This is quite clear. Or they don't have enough money to afford renting or finding housing for themselves. But financial resource constraints not only means getting money, but also the assets to generate money. For example, land. Many communities in the developing world, especially, depend on agriculture, and if they do not have land, they cannot generate enough money. And if they cannot generate money, their housing situation gets affected. So that's the first constraint they face. The second constraint they face consistently and all over the world is their vulnerability to hazards, natural and man-made. And to deviate a little bit from the developing world, I should just mention that I should give an example of the Australian Aborigines, that there was one situation when they were not able to hear flood warnings because the radio channels that they could reach did not broadcast those warnings, so they were just inundated by floods. But of course, that happened because they were very, very poor, and it's their special condition of poverty which makes them more vulnerable to hazards. And all over the developing world, the poor people suffer much, much more. And all over the world, you see that poor countries suffer much, much more from natural and man-made disasters. And the third one is what is less documented, but which is known in general discussions and ideas.